Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. I am Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University, and it is really my distinct pleasure to introduce a conversation about the shifting landscape of reporting on Palestine and Israel, examining both the controlling narrative and received notions of objectivity. Of particular concern is that as new technology has helped challenge some of the biased practices of many major news outlets, social media platforms have begun to use digital tools to conceal unjust practice, turned what seemed a movement towards liberation and access on its head. A line I read years ago in a book of essays titled "Now Don't Try to Reason with Me" comes to mind, about how we all trust our own forms of credulity and are angered by the unreasonableness of others, especially when they claim to be defenders of reason. The book is by Wayne Booth, a scholar of rhetoric who posited that all narrative was engaged in an attempt to persuade, that there was no such thing as an impartial text because the author and the context were always at least partially shaping the meaning. Is there a better argument for the need for diverse voices in journalism? Booth's work, now half a century old and written long before there were social media platforms to regulate, manages to grant fresh insight into the need to examine the controlling powers in today's media. The forms of reason, which include military and financial interests, of course, being used to persuade policy decisions are part of the narrative, a way to rationalize the beliefs of those in power and to influence collective notions of objectivity. Reporters have spoken about language being curated by their editors, and the Associated Press has justified the use of officially sanctioned neutral language as a security measure, with a complete disregard for the safety of those without agency. The failure of social media to bring a diversity of voices to our attention was documented by Omar Zahzah last May in an article entitled "Digital Apartheid," which he wrote for Al Jazeera. In it, he pointed out that the neglect of Palestinian perspectives in the media has actually grown worse because of policy decisions of companies such as Facebook, YouTube, and even Zoom, the platform we are using now. What was once an absence is now an active decision to rout out and exclude. People who have tried to organize via these platforms have been denied access. Twitter and Instagram accounts from certain East Jerusalem neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah are systematically censored. On a planet in which everyone is immersed in a constant barrage of information, images, and networking opportunities, where, as Todd Gitlin argues in Media Unlimited, media is the world we live in and the platform from which identity is created and status determined. What does it mean to be erased, non-existent on social media? And who exactly is doing this erasing? How does purging certain voices as narrators of the story of what it means to be human, citizens of a shared earth, relate to purging people from the land they have long inhabited? Today, although the impetus to privilege Israel's story remains, more recognition of the injustices perpetrated against Palestinians is breaking through on social media and elsewhere. What is behind this extraordinary shift in both what is reported and the sentiment expressed around these issues is the question we have in front of us. There is so much to unpack here, and I can think of no better people than the ones I'm about to introduce to help illuminate the subject. Professor Greg Philo is Professor Emeritus at the School of Social and Political Sciences at Glasgow University, and he is Research Director of the Glasgow Media Group. Greg is the author with Mike Berry of More Bad News from Israel and Israel and Palestine, Competing Histories. He is also co-author with Emma Bryant and Pauline Donald of Bad News for Refugees. Welcome, Greg. Dr. Abir al-Najjar is Associate Professor of Media and Journalism Studies at the American University of Sharjah. She has written extensively about bias and cultural resistance in the Middle East, and she was a senior fellow at the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics. Hi, Abir. Dr. Omar Al-Ghazi is an assistant professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. His work focuses on questions around the global power asymmetries in the reporting and representation of conflict. He has published in the field of communications top journals, including Communication Theory, Journalism, and the International Journal of Communications. Hi, Omar. Marwa Fatafta is a Palestinian writer, researcher, and policy analyst, currently leading Access Now's work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa. A Fulbright scholar, Marwa is an advisory board member of the Palestinian digital rights organization Hamle and a policy analyst at Al Shabaka. And Marwa, I understand you've just arrived from Berlin to Hebron. So nice to see you. Finally, our moderator, Professor Dina Matar, is the chair of the Center for Palestine Studies and director of the Center for Global Media and Communication and the Center for Gender Studies at SOAS, the School for Oriental and African Studies in London. She previously worked as a journalist and editor in the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and the US. Dina, we are so grateful for your willingness to chair and moderate this very important panel. And Marwa, Omar, Abir, and Greg, welcome, and thank you so much for doing this. Over to you, Dina.
Thank you so much, Safwan. That was brilliant. And you kind of summarized quite a lot of the material that we work on and we research, and we are obviously debating quite a lot with our students and in our work. It was very eloquent, very clear, and I think loads of questions arising out of it. So thank you. And thank you for introducing the work by Omar Zahzah in particular that I have read and enjoyed. Without further ado, I want to kind of invite our speakers in the following order. I'll start with Greg, and then I move on to Abir, and then Marwa, and then finally Omar. And what I hope that each of the speakers will speak for, let us say 7 minutes, at a stretch 10 minutes, so we have time for questions and answers. And then maybe I can invite the audience to ask questions in the Zoom question and answers icon, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask a question to the whole panel, then please make that clear. And if you want to ask a question to a particular panelist, then also make it clear. I might also have questions myself, and obviously this is a conversation. It is not like a PowerPoint or a lecture. It's a conversation about really topical issues, particularly at a time where, kind of the marginalized, the people who have been spoken about, but who have not been allowed to speak, are really very relevant to understanding global politics, cultural politics, histories, and media practices. And as Safwan said, which he kind of focused on in his talk, is that media is everywhere. It's embedded in everything that we do. We have our mobile phones, we are all connected to different forms of media, so we cannot escape it. So what does it all mean? I'm really looking forward to what our esteemed speakers have to say, and I'll start with no other than Professor Greg Pylon. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for asking me to speak. I'll speak about the research which we did at Glasgow University, and we published in a series of books, as we've heard. The first was called actually Bad News from Israel, and we did more bad news from Israel. And we have been looking at this area for a period. We were particularly interested in coverage in the mainstream media, and the parameters that were set in for explanation of the Israel-Palestine conflict within mainstream media. We looked particularly at the BBC and the independent news, and we were very concerned to see what sorts of explanations were given, how different explanations of the conflict were highlighted or left out at times, and also what the impact was on audiences, what people ended up believing. And I'm often asked to explain the conflict. I mean, when I was doing these books, it was frequently I was contacted by people in the media. And I remember one occasion I was asked by a local radio station in Glasgow, who rang me up and said, there's a lot of coverage of this, you know, our listeners don't really understand what's going on. Could you explain the conflict, you know, to our listeners? And I said, but you're talking about sort of 3 minutes. And they said, well, you know, more like 15 seconds, really. And so this was set to me as a sort of challenge, you know, to could I explain the conflict in a few seconds? And when I thought about it, I thought, of course, there are endless nuances. There's a long history. Everything is contested. But really, it's not impossible to describe the core of this conflict from the perspectives of different sides. I mean, if you look at what the Israelis are saying, they would say they are threatened, they are the victims in this, they are a democracy which is being attacked, they're surrounded by enemies, they are subject to terrorist attacks, they want to be a normal democracy, they want peace, but they are under attack, and the reason is this is terrorism and anti-Semitism. And if you ask the Palestinians, they will say, well, conflict is about us losing our land and our homes when Israel was set up. We've lost our water. We're living under a brutal apartheid-style regime, under military rule, under military occupation, and we're trying to throw that off. And that, I mean, there's obviously much more to say, but that's the core of the dispute. And very few people in Britain, I would say, could actually explain those two sides. What you would find when you go and ask people is that people will have heard the first version, rather more than they will have heard the second. And when I spoke to journalists about this, you know, they confirmed this with me. I remember when we did the book, I spoke with lots and lots of journalists, and one senior reporter made this point to me that the area they just didn't get across, the area that they didn't cover, was that second argument, that this was a people trying to throw off an occupation. I mean, it's really as simple as that. That was the Palestinian view. And what he said was, what is missing is the view that this is an uneven war. He's talking about BBC coverage, and that it is a war of national liberation, a periodic guerrilla war, sometimes using violent means in which a population is trying to throw off an occupying force. And a few years ago, I was asked to go on a BBC program on Radio 4, on the well-known Today program, which is one of the best listened to programs on BBC Radio. And I went on in the morning, and it was at a period in which the conflict was active and violent. And I was asked about what I thought of the coverage, you know, and I said exactly what I've just said, you know, that the Israeli view is present, that this is about, you know, terrorism, that they're under attack, that they're responding to attacks upon them. But the Palestinian view is not there, that this is a people who see themselves as living under a brutal apartheid regime, and they want to throw it off. And as you might imagine, the interviewer got rather upset and said, "Oh, that's a very controversial thing to say." And I said, "Well, actually, why would that be controversial? This is two sides. You report one of them, but you don't report the other. So the question is, why aren't you?" And I mean, I have to say to you, I've never asked back onto that program after that, but it was interesting. It was so rare that such a view was presented. And what you tend to find is that it's not the case that the Palestinians are absent in the media coverage. I mean, what you find repeatedly in coverage of the conflict is that Palestinians are there, Palestinian images of Palestinians are there. But what you will see is Palestinian suffering. So you have terrible images of bombing, of children suffering, of widows and of funerals, you know, the suffering of Palestinians is represented. But you can see what that means. What it means is you have one set of viewpoints, which is essentially explaining what is happening from the point of view of Israel, saying that they are under attack, that they are responding. And in fact, we measured things like that. We went off and we counted how many times the word response, retaliation was used in relation to each side. And we found that it was used very much more in relation to the Israelis than the Palestinians. And this then impacts upon how audiences see it. So although they are seeing images of Palestinian suffering, the explanation they're getting is that it's caused by a response to something the Palestinians have done. So when we then go out to focus groups and interview people and ask them, we'll say, what's your view of the conflict? How do you see it? People would say, oh, it's terribly sad. It's awful to see, what's happening to Palestinians. It's dreadful. All the suffering is awful. I cried. I remember one person saying to me, I cried when I saw the dead Palestinian babies. And then the next thing she said was, but if only the Palestinians would keep attacking the Israelis. If only they would keep starting the trouble. Because that whole history of what this is about from the point of view of the Palestinians, what they think they are doing, how they see the conflict, how they understand themselves as trying to throw off an occupation, that is what's missing. And I think that's an absolutely critical area to discuss in terms of impacts on public belief, on public understanding. And that's, in a nutshell, is what we found. And when I discussed this with senior people in the BBC, I remember going to a conference, I think in Sweden. I was with an extremely senior person, and in private, he said to me, yes, I think what you're saying is correct. That's what happens. That's what it is. But it's an extremely hard thing to get across the BBC, and they don't want to confront it. They don't want to talk about it. I think when the books first came out, the first book came out, they were prepared to discuss it. But I think the climate has become much sharper, much more difficult. When the second book came out, BBC simply didn't cover it at all. The first book, The Bad News from Israel, had resulted in a very large number of interviews and some, world service, BBC, on radio programs of the BBC, and I had received quite a lot of coverage. But all of that died as far as the BBC was concerned. But by the second book, it was the whole atmosphere had become much tighter. Now, I'm not going to talk any longer. You only wanted 7 minutes, didn't you? So I will stick to the rules, and I will hold that there, and we can obviously really have questions, things later on. Okay.
Thank you very much, Greg. That really set the scene pretty well. Abir, would you like to go next, please?
Yes, sure. If you can just, Dina, kindly warn me 1 minute before I finish so I can just wrap up. I'm not great with keeping time. Thank you. Thank you for the kind invite, and I'm very happy to be discussing this very, very timely and important issue. This is very close to my heart. My PhD was about reporting the question of Jerusalem in the British press. So I have sort of an overview of how the global media coverage have been dealing with the Palestinians, with the Israelis, and with conflict over the place, over Palestine, historic Palestine. And I would like to start by bringing to our attention and like a phrase that has been striking to me because of how immediate it is, but also because of how strong it represents what's happening with the Palestinian from a social justice perspective and from a global perspective. Judith Butler in 2012 wrote that grievability is unequally distributed. She raised the question of how the world often fails to respond equally to human suffering, as the attribution of the grievability of a human life is unequally allocated. For decades, the conflict and discourse and the narratives over the Palestinian-Israeli conflict were constructed, they were mediated, and they were mediatized. Of course, including notions of ethical righteousness, legitimate violence, victimhood, and so on. So my sort of very direct question all the time is, what has been the role of the media in legitimizing Israel's crimes against the Palestinians? And how decisions that are automatic or negotiated within the newsrooms of every news outlet have impacting for years the rights of the Palestinians to be liberated and the rights of the Palestinians to be heard, to be seen, as Edward Said puts it, as he puts the Palestinian struggle as a struggle for visibility. So it is the right to be seen, it is the right to have access and to tell one's own story. And that has been the struggle of the Palestinians. And just speaking of, technological evolution and the liberalization, and I'm not sure how effective this liberalization have been to the Palestinians as much as to the rest of the Arab public in their struggle for freedom and for basic human rights, considering the political economy controlling the media, whether it platformized media or platform media or other mainstream media. So the struggle of the Palestinians over the 100 years was for visibility, to be seen, to be heard, and for their right to tell their own story and to call themselves Palestinian, which is a notion that they have earned after several decades of struggle, and the story to call themselves also and to claim their position as people in the world stage. So every single notion and label that have been the Palestinians struggling to gain took them several decades to achieve that. In an overwhelmingly biased, and we can talk a lot about reasons for this bias, but in a dominantly biased international news arena against the Palestinians, and we can see how this bias is somehow integrated within editorial policies of different news organizations. The Palestinians are still struggling to have their part of the story told fairly, equally, and articulately. So one cannot approach the Palestinian reporting the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and I know that Omar in a little bit will be talking about this, but without problematizing the issue of the huge imbalance in powers, whether these powers in technological and informational infrastructure, or when it comes to the huge machine, to the huge information machine that Israel and the pro-Zionists, also its collaborators, they do own around the world. And one has also to look at the issue of power dynamics and imbalances as they relate to the day-to-day representation of the Palestinians, their rights, and how do they impact, and what are the consequences of this huge imbalance in power on competing frames. Because for every story, as everyone in the room knows, for every story, there are several frames, several interpretations that are usually embedded with bits and pieces of information, with certain visual framing selections that can change the way how people respond, whether rationally or emotionally, to the news story that we're dealing with. There is also a contestation of power and a huge imbalance of power over access and control. So who controls the narratives? Who can impact the global narrative after even it's broadcasted or it's being published? Who has more right for their point of view to be corrected, and not only to be adopted at the very beginning, but to be corrected also? Who has the power of labels? Who's more ready? Who's more prepared? Who's more well-resourced to deal with international media and with global news sources? Also, it's about information manipulation and the huge this new field of weaponization of algorithm and analytics and so on. So who is more equipped to deal with whatever emerging? Because we see that breakthroughs have been happening through social media, but we also have seen and have witnessed how these breakthroughs are somehow sort of preempted and by some systematic efforts by the State of Israel. And also how all of this manipulates the general public opinion, the global public opinion, when it comes to the legitimacy of action and particularly violence. So whose violence is justified, whose violence is explained, whose violence is not terrorism, right? And whose violence is terrorism. In 27, The Economist, there was a commentary in The Economist that was also very striking in the sense of this imbalance and very representative, when the title was reading, Palestinians are not only outgunned, but they're also out-messaged. And this is just one of the several sort of acknowledgements of international news organizations and media as to how the Palestinian story is always misrepresented, and it's always not very, is not fair to the Palestinian. We have to look also at the issue of shifts in images. We can, although we can claim, and I claim that the Western-oriented or quote-unquote Western-based news media who are influential on the global stage, at least the English-speaking I'm talking about right now, have been for long periods of time, they have been biased against the Palestinians and more in favor of the Israelis for so many reasons. There were a few changes, and there are a few sort of breakthroughs that happened over time. Historically, if we look at these shifts, we can see major shifts from 1948 to 1967, when the Palestinians moved from the voiceless refugees, from being completely invisible to voiceless refugees, because it was an empty land then in before 1948 and after the declaration of the State of Israel. In 1987, for example, and 1993, the portrayals of the Palestinians moved toward more positive light, as in the sense of, there was a recognition of the right of the Jewish people to have a state, for self-determination, to have a state. Palestinian people then became peace partners, and they became Palestinian people only in 1993, which is like almost more than 50 years after 1948. Although in 2000, again, Israel came to be more in control of the narrative, with Sharon claiming that Israel is also is facing terrorism equal to the terrorism that happened, and it was just 20 years ago, the anniversary of 9/11. So the whole story of suffering from terrorist groups and organizations, these Muslim terrorists, and we fit the profile. We're Muslim. I mean, many of the Palestinians are Muslim. So, and it was in the aftermath of a visit to a mosque. So there were some elements of the story that were highlighted and reproduced to bring an image to the Palestinians. Of course, after the dependency of the international media, particularly on official discourse, and particularly the official discourse in the United States, to tell the Palestinian story. So in Camp David in 2000, there was this huge shift also in reporting the Palestinians as not peace partners, as not willing to compromise again over Jerusalem, which sort of highlighted the religious aspect that came handy in the service of the Israeli narrative and the Israeli control. I want to...
I'm getting concerned about time, and I see Dina is as well.
Perfect. I just want to bring two important breakthroughs that happened in the past few weeks, in the past few months, the Sheikh Jarrah protests and intifada and the escaping prisoners. And in both cases, there seemed to have been a breakthrough in how the Palestinians were back in control, their voices were there. And it's very important to study as to what were the dynamics that led to these sort of the emergence of the Palestinian voice over this, but also we need also to pay attention as to the Israeli efforts in shifting the narrative, shifting the frame, and shifting the blame consequently related to this. So if I am to end with two important notes here, and I'm happy to elaborate more, but if I am to end with two important notes, one of them is we have a huge room, the Palestinian and the pro-Palestinian, we have a huge space here to expand holding global media accountable for what they do, which is something also we have witnessed, like answerable to their editorial decisions, which is something we have witnessed in the past few weeks. The other point of concern is that also with the increase in critical engagement with mainstream media by young people and by activists, and the growth of solidarity, we can have perhaps a more favorable future in the sense of the coverage. Maybe this is a little bit of an optimist perspective, but I really hope that this could work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abir. That was brilliant, and it kind of makes us think about the question of media being an extended battlefield for the battle on the ground. So media are part of the social processes. I move on quickly to Marwa, who might want to talk more around questions of rights and justice, particularly that Abir started with Judith Butler and grievability. And these are philosophical questions that are really relevant in this case. But Marwa, please, looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Dina, and hi, everyone. Really a pleasure to be joining this panel. And I hope my connection will stay stable throughout my contribution and also the session. If not, I can turn off my video. Hopefully it will work. But I would like to focus on the suppression and censorship of Palestinian voices on social media or in the digital sphere, which is a topic I've been researching in 2015 when the Israeli authorities for the first time paid attention to social media platforms as an environment that radicalizes Palestinian youth and incites to violence, and since then has been applying mounting pressure on tech companies to censor and remove Palestinian content under the pretext of fighting terrorism. And I will expand more on the contours or topography of oppression online in a bit, but I want to start by pointing at the obvious, which is, since the Nakba in 1948, Palestinians realized the importance of maintaining and sharing their narrative of dispossession, because that's a core part of their resistance and a core part of their liberation in the face of Israel's settler colonialism, which is a big component of this structure is the erasure of Palestinian narrative, the erasure of Palestinian existence, both physical and in this case also digital. And therefore, Palestinians have been denied the permission to narrate, to use the words of Edward Said, which have been invoked also lately in light of the recent censorship online. To just give you one example, take for instance the absence and marginalization of Palestinian voices and perspectives from US media. A Palestinian scholar, Mahan Najjar, she analyzed this trend in US daily press, and the numbers are really striking. So in the New York Times, in nearly 2,500 opinion pieces published since the 70s, only less than 2% have been written by Palestinians. And in the Washington Post, the average was just 1%. Now, the uprisings of May and June, and particularly the protest of Sheikh Jarrah, which Abir mentioned, they've succeeded in taking significant leaps in shifting the media landscape and reporting, which not only marginalized Palestinian voices and perspectives, but also rendered them invisible, and in some cases deserving of their own suffering and deserving of the violence inflicted on them or upon them by propagating this myth of both sidism, and that there are two parties to the conflict, where in fact, in reality, it's an oppressed people living under an oppressive occupation. And here, social media platforms did indeed play a crucial role in surpassing the gatekeepers of traditional media, and Palestinians have found a platform or a medium through which they can narrate and stream their realities to freely show the images, sounds, videos, and words that are largely censored and decontextualized in traditional media under the illusion of objective reporting. However, I would like to caution from idealizing the role of social media in revolutionizing access and sharing of information, because as we've seen in the events of the Save Sheikh Jarrah campaign, when the campaign started trending, hundreds, if not thousands, of content were removed on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, and immediately, as part of digital rights groups working on social media issues and digital rights, we flagged to social media platforms that you have been maintaining a public line, that you're committed to human rights, that you're committed to the freedom of expression to all of your users around the world, of giving people a voice. Yet again and again, we see that marginalized communities, historically oppressed communities, are the first to be censored on those platforms. So when we flagged the issue, Instagram immediately apologized and said that this was due to a technical glitch or a technical error. Unfortunately, in the coming days or weeks, we've seen that content was not only removed, but users were almost like punished for sharing and speaking up on Palestine. For instance, their accounts were suspended for a few days, their live streaming was stopped, and this is particularly important when we think of videos from Sheikh Jarrah being live streamed on Instagram, Facebook, and elsewhere. Accounts not being able to use the simple functions of the platforms like liking, sharing, or commenting on posts, which is really unusual for me as someone who has been working on content moderation issues for quite some time. It was very clear that social media platforms have weaponized their entire infrastructure to suppress a narrative. Now, social media companies, the majority of them are based in the US, with the exception of TikTok, which is a Chinese company. They long maintained that they are non-political, that they take a non-political stance on issues, that they are not media institutions, and therefore they don't have editorial capacity, because they have been criticized either for overdoing removal and deletion of content, or not doing much. When we talk about the US elections and disinformation, when we talk about child abuse, pornography, and other issues, they come under fire for not doing anything. And the leadership of Facebook in particular have said, well, we're not a media institution, we're not editors. So the power of the old gatekeepers maybe seceded for a bit, but the power of the custodians of the internet, or the new gatekeepers of the internet and of flow of information, which are tech companies, do exercise a form of editorial control through their content moderation policies. So they're not held liable, legally speaking and otherwise, for all of the user-generated content that is shared and posted on their platforms, but they decide on the rules of which content is allowed and which content is not. Now, when it comes to Palestine, we see that tech companies overuse some of their rules related to terrorism, related to quote-unquote extremist content. And here, when we zoom in on the interpretation, or when we zoom in on the application of these rules and policies, we see that social media companies take the side of the Israeli authorities in terms of interpreting speech, political speech. So words such as shaheed, Zionism, resistance are often removed, censored, and overly suppressed because these are interpreted as words that incite to violence or words that praise, support, or represent terrorism. Now, under these rules, for instance, if we remember last year, the event at the San Francisco State University where Leila Khaled was supposed to join as a speaker, and the event was removed on 3 platforms, on Zoom, on Facebook, and on YouTube. The rule used here was, again, a rule related to terrorism because Leila Khaled is a member of a designated group, and therefore the event should be removed from such platforms. And again, who decides on what constitutes terrorism? There is no universal definition of what terrorism is. And therefore, these platforms, again, lean on the Israeli authorities for interpreting such speech. Again, the word shaheed, we discovered that through private consultation with Facebook, that they have a special rule called the shaheed policy, which if used in conjunction with another designated group, so for instance, if I use the word shaheed to in conjunction with Ghassan Kanafani, who is also a member of a designated group, that content is considered a terrorist content or a dangerous content and therefore will be removed. If we look at over censorship, so the events of May and June, as I said, thousands of content have been removed, and almost everybody who spoke on Palestine faced some form of censorship or suppression, either by deletion of content or suspension of accounts and so on. Yet on the other side, Palestinians face incitement to violence by Israeli groups, as we've seen the use of platforms to organize pogroms against Palestinians in 1948. And according to some organizations like the work of Hamle, there's incitement to violence against Palestinians every 66 seconds. And yet we see that platforms don't take any action against that kind of speech towards Palestinians. So we see double standards in the application of those content moderation policies, where there's over-enforcement and therefore over-censorship of Palestinian speech, and lack of enforcement and therefore flourishment of anti-Palestinian narrative and speech on those platforms. Now, within this ecosystem, we cannot, of course, forget the role of the Israeli authorities in shaping that digital sphere. As I said, in 2015, to the Israeli government, Facebook has been responsible for the third intifada, or the intifada of individuals back in Jerusalem, and have, as a result, been trying to force its own rules and interpretations of speech on social media platforms. A year later, in 2016, the Attorney General set up a special unit dedicated for monitoring and submitting requests for removals to social media companies called the Cyber Unit. Now, the Cyber Unit monitors social media platforms and submit requests to social media companies that these type of content violates the terms of services of those platforms. And unfortunately, now, because of civil society pressure on tech companies, to a certain extent, they've started providing transparency on government requests for censorship and content removal. But those kind of requests have to rely on a form of a judicial order, for instance, showing the company that this content is illegal in this jurisdiction and therefore needs to be removed. Now, in the context of Israel, those requests are voluntary in nature, which mean that they don't violate any law in Israel. And of course, in this case, the Israeli law doesn't apply to Palestinians, but the importance of this piece of information is that social media platforms don't publish any numbers on these requests, and therefore we don't know to what extent have the Israeli authorities succeeded in censoring the Palestinian content that we've seen back in May and June. Sometimes the Israeli Cyber Unit publishes numbers itself. So for instance, it said that it submitted around 1,000, over 1,000 requests to social media companies, and the compliance rate has been equally high. So companies comply by 80 up to 90% of those requests. And yet in private and public conversations with platforms, they have denied us these numbers. They have not provided any transparency on to what type of content do they remove, what type of content has been reported to them, how do they comply. And so we've launched a campaign called Facebook Stop Silencing Palestine. And what we hope is for Facebook to conduct a public audit into their content moderation policies and actions related to Israel and Palestine, because we deserve and we need transparency on how these platforms make decisions and why certain communities like the Palestinians often get censored while others, namely here Israelis, don't. I would end by saying that Palestinians, even though we did succeed in this protracted war between myth and truth, in some narrative breakthrough. However, digital suppression and the different forms of digital violence, to me, is really a new frontier for Palestinian resistance. And we need to make sure that those spaces available to us remain as free and as censored as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm conscious that we are running out of time, and there are some, the audience would like to have some questions. But I would like to turn very quickly to Omar to give us a conceptual background, and we can return to some of the issues that each of the speakers raised once we respond to questions. Omar, please.
Yes, thank you, first of all, Dina, for organizing this and for the invitation. I want to start with perhaps putting the question of reporting of Palestine in a more global context, because we know that the value of human life and the very conception of what is a news story is an unequal phenomenon in Western reporting, and usually this is done through agenda setting and through basically silence, through the underreporting of deaths and suffering that happen in the global South, more generally, rather when compared to the global North. So we see this happening in Palestine, that the attention is turned on Israel-Palestine only when Israelis are affected, when it is an ongoing story of settler violence, of expansion, of daily violence and killings and restrictions of movements and occupation. That is not really reported. But when there is a flare-up of violence that becomes a global story, a lot of Western media then go to the false balance kind of error, which was referred to by some of my colleagues. The idea, which is, we see it a lot in Western reporting, it is basically, particularly in broadcast media, where you just give 2 minutes to the Palestinian perspective, 2 minutes to the Israeli perspective, as if that is reflecting the power dynamics on the ground, or even telling a truthful story of what is happening. Because that structure gives the impression that it is two equal sides fighting, which we know is not the case. But when there is actually attention to the Palestinian side, in these circumstances, there are techniques of dehumanization that I think followers of the conflict on Western media would be familiar with. I will mention some of them. and then perhaps just end with the notion of social media and how it is disrupting or changing that dynamic. So the techniques of dehumanization, some of it is through language, and a lot of it is subtle. So the strategic use of the passive voice. The clearest example of that is who kills and who dies. So typically, when Israelis die, they are killed, and when Palestinians die, they die. You know, they're not. No one is actually killing them. So that is one example. Even when there is loss of life in Palestine, a lot of the time we see narratives talking about martyrdom, which was also mentioned. The idea that there is somehow a culture of martyrdom in Palestine, that as if people don't even want to live. Like there's this very racist, Orientalist trope that we see in a lot of news, and I have to say that's a lot of this we see with Gaza specifically, the idea of martyrdom. There's also, in relation to temporality, the relation between temporality and morality, we also see a lot of kind of very subtle ways of or maybe not so subtle, of dehumanization. The idea that even though right now Palestinians are victimized and dying more, but in fact, if Palestinians had the power, they would want to kill many more people. So it becomes this almost like fictional world that regardless of what is happening on the ground now, the morally Palestinians are more perhaps immoral in this fight, because had they had the ability, they would kill more. That's also a trope that I've seen a lot in Western media. And even the very idea of freedom, when Palestinians talk about freedom and you know, forcefully say that they want their how they're fighting for their freedom, so somehow freedom becomes as if it's the scarce commodity that if Palestinians are free, then Jewish Israelis are not. So freedom is not this public good that is a fundamental human right. It becomes as if it's the scarce commodity that if Palestinians get it, it's taken away from Jewish Israelis. The whataboutism, the false comparisons between different contexts, is also a trope I think we're familiar with. So moving the issue from Palestine to compare it to other conflicts, and doing so strategically just to not talk about Palestine and the Palestinian struggle. And finally, the point that I wanted to also end on in these ways of dehumanizing is the deployment of complexity. The idea that, which is another like really Orientalist trope, the idea that, oh, you know, Palestinians and Israelis, it's so complicated, bringing religion, like who knows, you know, this has been happening for centuries, and it's as if it's almost beyond explanation, and that is another very old but ongoing trope of dehumanization, because it takes away from what is happening on the ground and from actual history that is not so hard to explain, a history of settler colonialism, where instead of talking about, you know, the last few decades, the kind of reporting goes to thinking about centuries rather than decades of lived experience and of dispossession in Palestine. Now, so this is kind of some of the tropes that we see in news media, in whether it's broadcast or print media. Now, with recently, like in the past, we can say 15 years, increasingly, these tropes have been disrupted not in a way, not in a technologically deterministic way, as if social media necessarily means the empowerment of ordinary people, but in a sense, the shifting terrain of how narratives are fought and contested, because I think the form of news broadcast media now has to incorporate ordinary voices. This is the expectation of audiences. This is what happens in the reporting of conflict, and this has many reasons attached to it. We can, some of those reasons are political economy of news, but I think it's a broader culture of expectation. This idea of authenticity in news, and usually, like, we tend to talk about it in broad terms, but there's a geopolitics attached to whose voices get listened to and how they enter global news. And I think, so if we talk about, let's say, the Arab world, like we saw that in particular periods in time, for example, in Libya, before NATO intervened in Libya, on Western news, there was a lot of, suddenly a lot of voices of ordinary Libyans were incorporated into news narratives. In Syria, from 2011 to 2014, there were also a lot of voice of Syrian witnesses that were incorporated in news. And then, like, that doesn't last for a long time. And even in those periods when there is attention, it is also the power structure is still there. So now I have a piece that's going to come out soon, written with my colleague Lili Khilyaraki, where we argue that ordinary voices get incorporated in global news narratives through the idea of what we're calling flesh witnessing, that the witness has to be vulnerable, that their bodies have to be facing risk and death in order for them to actually acquire value in news narratives. And that is when there is even space for them, because in a lot of conflicts, there isn't even that space. Now, it's interesting to think about this in relation to Palestine, particularly the Sheikh Jarrah story. And I think there we saw the new phenomenon that we saw is the emergence of witnesses who are very eloquent. I'm thinking particularly of Muhammad al-Kurd, and how eloquent and he is in explaining what he is witnessing, which is like extremely difficult to do when you're the one who's actually facing, like, not only you're facing the conflict and the trauma of dispossession, but you also somehow get the task of explaining to the world what is happening to you. So that is what happened in Syria. But in Palestine, I think the eloquence of Muhammad al-Kurd and others, of course, like not only in Jerusalem, but also of the Palestinian diaspora, that they really found a space that is difficult to ignore in how they talked about their experiences and how they explained the history. So I know I'm running out of time, but I'll just conclude that I think like that phenomenon is perhaps new in a way. We can talk about it as the emergence of maybe like star witnesses that have authority that is projected on them to tell the story. But with the emergence of these voices, we see the backlash on that. Like as Marwa explained, the censorship that is emerging on social media platforms, the targeting of these voices to delegitimize them. And even now in the academy, for instance, we can talk about how while a lot of academics and journalists and people in the cultural sphere in the West are speaking more about Palestine, we see the backlash of it in policing that speech and even making it illegal in many cases, particularly in Germany, but also in the UK, to present a Palestinian narrative. So it's not like it's not a happy story to end on in terms of social media, that the struggle continues, but it takes perhaps different forms.
Thank you, Omar, because I think we are now going to try and get to the questions. But these are all important points, and trying to think about whether social media is allowing more visibility and voice or not, and which voice matters. But also, I just want to say very briefly, is that it's not only in the UK and the US that is, kind of dismissing the story or restricting the narrative. We also see it in parts of the Arab world. So there is, the first question was whether we asked some Jewish scholars and panelists to join. We did ask them, but they were not available. And also, it's important to kind of focus on what Palestinian scholars and communities have to say. There was a question about data, where do we want to get that? So maybe we can put up some reading material that the audience can get, can have access to. So we will make sure that all those who participated can get some, kind of reading material and stats relating to our topic today. There's a general question from Sausan, which I think is quite interesting. Do you think that the question is unique to Palestinians? Can we think about colonial French encounters with insurgents to try and tell us a bit more around voices and around the media coverage of that? So maybe one of you could answer that, because then I can go on to some more specific questions to specific speakers. Would anyone like to answer this question about, kind of thinking about, let us say, the Algerian independence struggle, or let us say the continuous struggles of Black communities against racism? So how can that help us intellectually and theoretically speaking to think about Palestine and its coverage? Anyone would like? Yes, Omar.
I'll just briefly say that that I guess we have to think in two ways. First, the continuities with anti-colonial struggles, and it's always surprising that how much of the broad discourse that happens in relation to modern day warfare and conflict is actually reminiscent of colonialism, in terms, let's say, one example is in terms of believability. So, if you read, or even like if you read Fanon, I think that would be a great place to start in terms of explaining kind of like the colonizers' gaze into the colonized, and also the politics of believability in terms of the colonized, but also I think we have to, while keeping in mind kind of these continuities, we have to think about how they apply on a very different media terrain today, not only in relation to the digital, but also in news formats, in kind of more participatory, seemingly participatory media and platforms. So I think it is a balance to think of disruptions and continuities.
Thank you very much. So there's a question to Abir and Greg. Is there an imeu.org equivalent in the UK? IMEU, International Media. I can't. It's from Tariq Adur. Can you see the? Can you?
I think IMEU is the Middle East. Institute for Middle East Understanding, I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, there's Kabul. There is the Kabul, which is the Council for Arab, Arab
British understanding.
British understanding. Yes.
Yeah.
So I hope that question was answered, Tariq. David gave a very good comment here. Headlines in today's New York Times: Israeli forces kill 5 Palestinians accused of planning terror. note passive versus active verbs. And this is something that, media scholars focus on as well. Diana has a question about reporting in Germany, bringing in the German context, saying that it is especially difficult to report on Palestine in Germany. Anyone questioning the Israeli perspective is quickly labeled anti-Semite. Is there any way that can be done to counter this? Greg, maybe you want to answer this, given the historical context and the anti-Semitic kind of labeling that is going on in the UK.
Can you just give me the question again? What was actually asked?
The question was asked, the question was more of a comment saying that it is very difficult to report on Palestine in Germany because you quickly are accused of being an anti-Semitic. Pictures of Palestinian flags are to symbolize anti-Semitism. What do you think can be done to counter this?
Well, there needs to be a very clear definition of what anti-Semitism is. And I think the situation is different in Germany because of its history and because of the way in which German politicians and others have particularly framed this and argued about this. I think it's different in the UK, but there has been an intense debate, as you know, about anti-Semitism. But actually within that debate, Palestine is rarely or not often mentioned. It's almost as if it's the kind of elephant in the room sometimes, but it's not discussed. But I think it is extremely complex. I did a whole book called on anti-Semitism and the debate within the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn. And one of the things we said was that there is anti-Semitism in British society. You can find people who make the leap between the bad treatment of Palestinians as they see it to the sorts of bad things that Jewish people do. And I mean, I've seen, really appalling things said by people. But what then happens is that that then becomes a political tool, a political weapon. So the press will seize upon that and give a version of what is happening in the Labour Party, which is much, much greater in terms of numbers than anything that was actually proved. But behind all of that beyond all of that, I should say, is another whole argument, which is the key issue of how do you define anti-Semitism? If anti-Semitism is understood as a hatred of people for being Jewish and a characterization of action as being Jewish or negative because it's done by Jewish people, then that is clearly anti-Semitic. But one of the whole debates that we're now confronting and which people are now talking through, I think, which is behind what's been said here, is that how does the issue of anti-Semitism relate to Israel? Now, people have very different perspectives on that. Now, as you know, I was interested when you said you were asked, were any Jewish people asked? Well, the issue isn't on Israel. It's not simply asking Jewish people, because there are many Jewish people who are very critical of Israel, just as there are Jewish people who are very supportive of it. And on the other hand, there are non-Jewish people who are very critical of it and also are very supportive. I mean, you can look at Christians or evangelical Christians in America and the support that they give. So the key issue in relation to Israel has to be which group is defining what is anti-Semitic. And that becomes very complicated because you have some people who are arguing, both Jewish and non-Jewish people, that Israel is the true representative of Judaism, of the whole Jewish people, of all Jewish people, and that it represents the essence of being Jewish, that Israel represents the entire spirit of Judaism and Jewish people. And if you believe that, then it's obvious that a serious attack on Israel is by definition anti-Semitic, and that's what they believe. So in a way, to couch the whole thing as about sort of anti-Semitism as being used as a weapon to attack is not quite right. It's more that anti-Semitism is understood in a way such that an attack on Israel is necessarily anti-Semitic. And there are people who argue that, believe that. Now, the confusion that took place in the UK was that that was never unpacked. So the word anti-Semitism was simply bandied about, and it wasn't clear what people actually meant by it. And that was, of course, the great failure of Jeremy Corbyn, I think, or one of his failures, was that he and the leadership at the time never actually stood up and said, well, this is what we mean by anti-Semitism, and we're going to act on it in here and here, but this isn't what we mean by it. And so the confusion was extraordinary, and into that confused space, it entered all sorts of political actors who could use it and bat it, the term around as they wished. So that's a sort of, we need another seminar on this, but I mean, that seems to me to be the core of it. So if you're going to ask about how do you combat it, you need a very clear definition of what anti-Semitism is. And you need to say, that I mean, from your perspective, that anti-Semitism is not criticizing the actions of Israel or the actions of Israel, of supporters of Israel. And anti-Semitism is criticizing people for acting in a particular way because they are Jewish. So you can say that, that people support Israel and are acting in a way which is unacceptable, but that in itself would not be anti-Semitic. To say they're acting in a way that's unacceptable because they are Jewish would be. Yeah. So those are fine distinctions, but well, not that fine, they're absolutely crucial, and I think that's how you fight it. You need to bring this whole debate out in the open and say what you're talking about, essentially.
Okay, thank you, Greg. We'll come back to that later because we've got a few questions of clarification to different members. One about your sharing your research, one to Abir about what do you recommend in terms of action. You mentioned answer to editorials. Can you elaborate? One question to Omar: are the guidelines written anywhere? Can we use them for rebuttal of the mainstream arguments? And for Marwa, there are agreements between social media companies and Israeli government for censorship. How can we find out what the censorship algorithms are? So maybe if you could each reply in 1 minute each, not more than 1 minute, because we really need to move on to other questions. Thank you. Who wants to start?
Should I start?
Yeah, Abir, because I think, we can, Greg can share his research. Yes.
Okay, so one thing about the new platforms for media accountability, I think we have a great opportunity here, and this relates also to claims of anti-Semitism. So in a way, what activists and what members of the public can do is that to call on editors and ask them to provide explanation as to the choice of words and as to why is this language used. Because, for example, in terms of competing narratives and competing frames with the Sheikh Jarrah, for using forced evictions versus using a real estate sort of controversy. These were clear distinctions between different sets of verbs, different sets of linguistic choices that can completely change the interpretation and can call in international law, as when you say, for example, East Jerusalem is an occupied territory, right? So then you bring in different type of interpretation. So writing to news editors, to reporters, to journalists, and asking them, is this, how fair is this? How balanced is this? How accurate? And providing them with evidence that this is absolutely inaccurate, as with what happened with several news stories that were corrected later when Reuters even published the video and it was wrongly titled, or when, sometimes inaccuracy also happened. But we need to cultivate our sensitivity and our awareness of the significance of the use of signs within every story and the language, and then go them and ask them publicly on Twitter or on any other platform, as how do you explain this as an editorial judgment from an editorial perspective? There are several other ways that we can discuss, of course, but this is one of the most, which is, I call it a critical engagement with the content that they publish.
Well, thank you. Omar and then Marwa.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's been written on it, and there are a lot of Palestinian voices that talk about this. But I think it is useful, actually, maybe to have like to have like certain guidelines or a succinct like summary of like a rebuttal. So yeah, that's a great idea, and maybe maybe we could talk about doing that later on, actually. So yeah, thanks.
And Marwa?
Yeah, I would like to actually demystify a bit about the issue of algorithm, because often they receive a string of bad associations, being biased, oppressive, censoring of Palestinian voices. But generally speaking, platforms use algorithms in two ways. One, to curate content. So when we log into Facebook, whatever comes to our newsfeed is a result of algorithms, which in many cases actually deny human agencies in accessing information, but that's another story. Now, they also use algorithm to moderate content because of the huge volume of user-generated content being shared on the platforms every second. It becomes very hard to human reviewers to review content and make decisions. And therefore, social media companies deploy these tools. They are designed by people. So it's really important to keep in mind that they are designed by people to make certain decisions. And in the Palestinian context, one might ask, why, for instance, Facebook decided that while the Israeli army storms into Al-Aqsa Mosque in an evening of Ramadan in May to deactivate the hashtag Al-Aqsa in Arabic. Now, platforms say that was a technical glitch. But we ask here, who decided from the engineers that Al-Aqsa was a terrorist term? Because they mixed it with Al-Aqsa brigades. So these are decisions obviously are inherently political. They reflect biases, they reflect power asymmetries on the ground, and they are pretty much dictated by the powerful in the room here, which is the Israeli government and the Israeli occupation. The terms that the algorithms are out there to detect and automatically remove, like in the case of Al-Aqsa, for instance, are clear examples where we see algorithms being deployed for censorship and oppression.
Okay, thank you, Marwa. Just to say briefly that I was asked by Facebook to kind of give my opinion on the terms, particularly the term shaheed. And it was very interesting to hear what they had to say, because they seemed to be very insisting on the fact that, well, we have to think about it in terms of its terrorist connotations. But Marwa, there is another question to you. Do you think that non-US-based, the use of non-US-based digital platforms like TikTok would help?
Yeah, that's an excellent question that I've been asked repeatedly the past few months. I don't think, unfortunately, at this point in time, we have the luxury to migrate to other platforms. We can always create alternatives, but the massive audiences are on the large platforms, namely Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. And in the case of TikTok, we've also seen censorship there, despite of Palestinian youth in particular finding a refuge in that platform when it first emerged and became popular. And nevertheless, in May and June, a lot of content has been removed there. So even if it's non-US company, the same dynamic is repeated there, because at the end of the day, these are commercial companies. They're driven by profit over people, and they're interested in appeasing whatever government that could either regulate them. So they're always afraid of being regulated and therefore losing their power over dictating the rules on the platforms, or by losing their users and therefore their profit and their bottom line. And so I think in this case, the Palestinians are not interesting in terms of a market, and they're not opposing any legal threat in terms of regulation. And therefore, we are the easiest to be censored without any accountability or a price for the companies to pay, as opposed to other users in the US, the European Union, or even Israel in this case.
Maybe we should create our own platform. But there's a question here that is a general one. Well, one about how the Holocaust has been brilliantly exploited. But another question to Marwa or Omar, will the creation of virtual Nakba museums on the web help the Palestinians to get more justice? Is that a question that you feel you could answer, Omar, or one of you, or even Abir?
Yeah, like I'll just say, like that is in terms of memory politics, that's part of the activism that is happening and is a very important aspect, because it is the erasure of Palestinian voices is not just about, you know, we talked mostly now about the news, which is a very instantaneous kind of modality of media, but history and memory is very much a part of it, and Dina has worked on this, and I think there is an aspect about narrative, but also about social media platforms themselves, because the building of digital archives by grassroots communities is very important, because it takes away this content from social media companies that are not interested in maintaining them. If somehow they change the algorithm and decide that something is no longer acceptable by their standards, all this material would be deleted, and we saw that in Syria, for instance, when a lot of the videos were deleted. So whether it is in the near past, things that are uploaded on YouTube to show atrocities, for instance, or to show Palestinian self-expression, or if it is in the distant past about history, I think one area of very important area of activism is digital memory.
Thank you, Omar. There is a last question about the mainstream media has long denied the Palestinian narrative. Do you think that since mainstream media has long built an image of credibility, that facts given by individual parties may be perceived as untrustworthy? So in a sense, this is a bigger question around news practices and routines of news gathering and news sources. But if anyone would like to comment on this in particular, anyone would like to comment, and my question is that, does mainstream media matter? What do you think?
Can I come in here?
Please, Abir. Yeah.
Yeah, mainstream media still matters, and it matters big time, and that's why, because whatever, I mean, the interconnectivity between mainstream media and activism and solidarity movement is really high. And I think we're in the process, we're always behind in terms of understanding the dynamics, like the evolving environment and the ecologies of technology that are built around, constructing who constructs the narrative, and the better we have awareness of still the significance and centrality of the mainstream media as record for the future, but also as shapers and as material provided and as this repertoire of the stories for the general public, and to be reproduced, to be criticized, to be engaged with. So what I'm saying is that mainstream media does matter, and we need to engage with mainstream media. It doesn't mean that we ignore the rest of the platforms or the rest of the formats, taking into consideration that we don't have ownership over the platforms, which means that for any organization to be able, or any group of individuals to be able to deliver their messages, we need also to think of our infrastructure. And this is a completely different question when it comes to the question of access and to the question of reach of certain narratives and certain actors. So we need to think of the question of reporting the Palestinian from a holistic perspective. On the one hand, mainstream media is very important, but also someone like Mona Al-Kurd and Muhammad, they were correcting the language, they were redirecting the questions. And that's really central to repositioning the actors within the international media scene and recorrecting the performance, like editorial practices within the international and global newsrooms. And this is a very long-term process, but if we have the right set of sort of terminology, the clarity of the significance of all signs, and how do these signs from the past or from the future impact the current response to current events, and so we're in a position to respond immediately, but also we need to have a strategic plan for that. And that's one of the weakest problems, and one of the biggest problems of the Palestinians is that our leadership has failed us all the time from that perspective. You don't have any sort of infrastructure in terms of conversation. We don't have any media monitoring services. It's all based on individual activism, act of charity and act of solidarity and nationalism. So we need to have some structures in place. And I think this is where the business people has to chip in and do something really constructive in terms of advising, archiving, digital museums, pressure groups that can affect, because one of the most important advantages Israel also has on us is the pressure groups and media monitoring groups that they have, pressuring the news media mainstream and pressuring these platforms all the time to go back to their own narrative, to define things from their own perspective and to control the narrative. I'm sorry I took longer.
No, that's very good. You ended this this panel on a very, very good note, very important note, which is how do we communicate better? Because this is the whole point. We can't always say we blame the others for our problems. We need to be more active. And I really, I'm really delighted with the young generation and how much they're doing. People like Muna and Ahmed al-Kurdi and other people. There are thousands of them. But I want to thank the panel for a brilliant discussion. We learned a lot from you. We simply didn't have time to do more. And thank you for all the questions from our guests. And if you have any more questions, please send them to us. And thank you for the Columbia Global Centers for hosting this meeting. And I'll pass over to Safwan now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you. I mean, this was really brilliant and so many wonderful contributions and so many dimensions and vignettes that we could spend, many, many hours on any number of them. I think it's fair to say that it is an evolving sort of set of issues, that you see some progress and some regress in various areas. I mean, I think the generational issue is also a very important one. So I'm glad that you brought that out, Dina. I think the younger generation represented here by Marwa, Abir, and Omar, sorry, Dina and Greg, and to myself, I'll also say sorry because we are of a different generation. I think one thing that has really happened, which I'm always fond of sort of underscoring, is that, Dina, you and I come from a generation where it was a political narrative, right? And for a while, also, it was a violent narrative that put Palestinians in the headlines. For the past 20 years or so, it's been a narrative that has been sort of taken over from the political machinery by young people like yourselves, living in London, living in Beirut, living in Berlin, artists, whether literary artists or artists in the form of cinema and theater and so on, who have narrated the human Palestinian story, right? So I noticed that on the participants list is Selma Dabbagh. Hi, Selma, if you're still there. That or Isabel, Hamad with her new book, The Parisian. I think, those have an incredible way of communicating sort of a history and a culture and a heritage and identity that is Palestinian. And that resonates also with the younger Jewish and non-Jewish audience also in the rest of the world and the United States in particular. So I think there is a generational shift in terms of how stories are communicated, what kind of narratives are out there, and who is, in a way, controlling them. I mean, Muhammad al-Kurd, or his sister Muna, what their command sort of the stage is, we can't even start to compare it to the political leadership. And as you said, I think Abir, has failed generations of Palestinians. Anyway, We could go on and on, but I think that there are, let's start to end on a hopeful, optimistic point, and that is, it's a shifting landscape, and there is more, I think, common understanding among younger people, and you see that on college campuses, and hopefully, there is a lot to look forward to in terms of the future for peace and justice and rights. Dina, thank you so much for so masterfully moderating this panel. Greg, thank you for coming out of retirement to be with us. This is really fantastic to get your views, and I know, Omar, that you're on sabbatical, so really, really grateful. And Marwa, having just landed in Al Khalil, Kaman, it's really great to have you. And Abir, thank you for these wonderful perspectives. So thank you all very much. Thanks to our audience. Thanks for the questions. And thanks to the Amman Global Centers team for really working behind the scenes to make this a reality. So thank you.